Hi Rod, welcome back to 10 by 6.
Good to be on again.
Superb to have you. A lot of what we're doing, what we've done in recent weeks, Rod, is topics where you've been able to draw together a lot of what you've been talking about over the last X number of months. So it actually gives some classic examples, if you like. And this week we're looking at the whole continent of Africa and how it's been ravaged by Western imperialists over the last 2 or 3 centuries at least. And effectively, it's taken a very rich continent, potentially, and impoverished it, principally using the tools of the military and economics. So you're now going to explain it, obviously in much more detail, how it all happened, how it all worked out, and the consequences.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. So we're going to talk a little bit about Africa because it draws together the different strands that we've talked about, and also it ties in nicely with a little bit of sort of historical understanding of colonialism. So I came across this this great quote, which it's attributed to a number of different people. Some people think it was the former Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Some people think it was the former Kenyan Prime Minister Jomo Kenyatta. But it doesn't really matter where it comes from. I think it's been used by a number of people over the years. And the quote is this: "When missionaries came to Africa, we had the land, they had the Bible. We closed our eyes to pray. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land." And I think that very nicely sort of summarizes what went on in the colonial era. And unfortunately, it's still true today. So if you look in the mainstream media, there's this general portrayal of the whole of Africa as this sort of collection of very backwards nations, lots of dictators, lots of ethnic rivalries where they don't seem to be able to stop fighting and they're not very civilized and so on. But this is a complete misrepresentation of what's gone on. And in particular, the mainstream media never ask the question, what role have advanced nations, particularly Britain, France, and the United States of America, played in keeping Africa in the state that it's in? So just to sort of set the scene, as you mentioned, Africa is sort of very rich in terms of its natural resources. In fact, many experts think it is the richest continent on Earth. So for hundreds of years now, people have used the term war gods, where gods is spelled in capital letters, referring to gold, oil, and diamonds. And people have been plundering those minerals from Africa for centuries. And then more recently, there are other minerals that are incredibly important in modern industries. So Africa is believed to hold much of the world's cobalt. And then there's another mineral called niobium, which is very important in any industry that operates in extreme conditions. So that can be space, weaponry, or reactors and refineries. And then more recently, there's a material called coltan, which is very important for mobile phones and computers. And it's believed that Central Africa holds most of the world's coltan. So one calculation was that the Democratic Republic of Congo alone, so one large country in the center of Africa, had resources estimated to be worth over 24 trillion US dollars. That's an astronomical amount of raw materials, but hardly any of the wealth that's there is ever used to benefit local people. So the idea is that rich countries, again, particularly the US, France, and Britain, support very repressive regimes in these countries because they will structure their economies in a way that benefits big companies from advanced nations. Now, we've talked in the past about Gaddafi, the Libyan leader who was overthrown in 2011. One of the reasons he was overthrown, because he was actually attempting to change this. He was attempting to unify African countries, change their currency, so it was much more difficult for other countries to exploit them, and to persuade African countries to use their resources for the benefit of their people. And Gaddafi himself had been quite successful at doing this. So Libya had by far the highest standard of living of all African countries, and it was right on the verge of being a first world country. Now, unfortunately, it's been completely destroyed by Britain, America, and France. So if we look back a little bit historically at the idea of colonialism, so up until approximately the end of World War II, Britain and France were the world's dominant colonial powers. Now, again, if you read the mainstream press in Britain, this is often presented as, and they use the phrase, taking civilization to the natives. But in fact, anybody who studies these things seriously recognizes that the primary goal of colonialism is to plunder the resources of other countries. And so Britain and France had occupation forces in lots of countries in Africa, and there was widespread murder, torture, and rape whilst we occupied those countries. And this went on for many, many years. Now, again, if you read the mainstream press, they say, hey, what about the railways? Didn't we give them a civil service? Didn't we give them a legal system? Well, we did give them certain things that were sort of byproducts of our presence, but various people have analyzed the railway systems and said, well, actually, they've been constructed in a way that takes soldiers into the center of the country from the coastlines where they would arrive, and then it allows resources to go from the center where they're mined over to the coast where they'll be shipped overseas. So the railway system was very much about soldiers and resources, not about providing a working transport system for the population who lived there. And then the civil service was very much about creating the minimal kind of system of bureaucracy that would allow advanced nations to control these countries, and a set of laws that really gave the advanced nations, Britain, America, and France, the ability to control and legally own the resources that we were exploiting. So it was a sort of tick box system that allowed us to claim we had the laws on our side and that we could own these things, but actually it was just legalizing a system of plunder. So there's a great researcher called Mark Curtis, who I've mentioned in a number of other presentations. He runs the website Declassified UK. Before he set up that website, he was a historian, and he spent much of his life going through what are called the declassified files of the UK government. So those are the files that were secret that have now been made publicly available. And these go back for many, many years. And you can actually look at what senior decision makers were saying to each other about the true motives for their policies in various situations. So in relation to the Sudan, there were various documents where one civil servant would be saying, we have been able to limit education to the sons of chiefs and native administrative personnel. So this is clear evidence that the aim was just to create the bare minimum education system in other countries to allow there to be a few people in those countries who would run the country on our behalf. If you look at Tanzania, which gained its independence in 1961, at the time of independence, they had only 2 engineers and 12 doctors. And of course, as soon as they were granted their independence, they trained up thousands of engineers and doctors. And that's something that Britain could have done, but we deliberately chose not to do that. So we were actively making sure that we did not create an advanced, well-informed populace. So the vast majority were just kept in ignorance. And there's a great writer called Walter Rodney, who years ago wrote a book called The Underdevelopment of Africa. And if anybody wants to understand the whole colonial era and how it worked and so on, that is an outstanding book, probably the best one to really understand what was going on from a critical perspective. Now, if we sort of come forward in time, immediately after World War II, so that's in 1945, Britain and France were no longer in a position to be able to maintain their empires. And so steadily over the next few decades, they ended the form of colonialism that had existed in most of those countries. And in theory, those countries were granted what's called independence. In practice, what happened was a form of neo-colonialism, where very powerful people in Britain and in France were still able to control much of those countries by other means. And in fact, again, Mark Curtis came across a report from 1947, a British report, which said the goal independence was to convert formal empire into informal empire. And the idea was that before independence was granted, you do land distribution to create a small elite group of landowners who would then be left to control the resources, but to run them in a way that would allow British companies to still control the most profitable mines and estates and farmland and so on. So in Kenya, which was granted independence in 1963, there were many mines and estates that were profitable. Lots of people in Kenya objected to what the British were trying to do in terms of land redistribution and creating these elite landowners. And so there were lots of protests, and this led eventually to what was called the Mao Mao Rebellion, which ended up with the British occupiers slaughtering large numbers of people in Kenya. And that sort of pattern happened in country after country. So leaders who tried to renegotiate the arrangements that had been left in place when independence was granted, they were targeted by the British and the French, and also by the Americans. So in fact, there was one research study that said from 1960 until 2003, 107 African leaders were replaced. Of those, 2/3 were murdered, jailed, or exiled. So it was really brutal. So in fact, no African leader lost an election before 1982. So what was happening was that Britain and France and America were supporting terrible dictators all over Africa. And anytime somebody came along who wanted to use the resources of the country for the benefit of their people, again, the advanced nations would work against them. So the rich nations were active behind the scenes all the time. So for example, in Uganda, it gained independence in 1961. The first leader to come to power was a guy called Milton Obote. Now, actually, he was in power on and off for quite a long period, and he had a very mixed record over that time. But initially, he really tried to help the poorest people in his country. Britain didn't like this, and we helped Idi Amin take power. Now, various older viewers will remember Idi Amin because he did appear in the press over and over again. He was one of the most insane mass murdering dictators there's ever been. It's thought that approximately 300,000 people died under his rule. We knew he was a brutal dictator when we helped him into power. We supplied him with weapons. Eventually, a few years later, Britain stopped supporting him because he was such an embarrassment to us internationally. But that's a good example of how Britain and the other powerful countries really do not care about human rights. If somebody is operating to try to help the poorest people get out of poverty, we will actively support military dictators to overthrow them, and we will help those dictators stay in power much of the time. So many people are unaware that France still exploits many African countries on a massive scale. And one of the mechanisms it uses to do this is that it controls the currency in many African countries. If you look at a particular example, so Togo was part of the sort of French Empire. They had a brutal ruler called Nazingbe who ruled for 40 years until 2005. So the French had basically put him in power when they left, and he ran the country for the benefit of French companies, but also he himself and his cronies would benefit significantly too. So he was rarely criticized by the mainstream press because he was so useful to the French government and to French companies. Another example would be the Ivory Coast, where French companies still own half the land and still control most of the major industries. So a huge amount of wealth and profit comes from the Ivory Coast into the pockets of rich and powerful French executives and shareholders, and does not stay in the country to benefit the poorest people. And there was a very famous sequence of events in the 1960s where the Congo had a leader called Patrice Lumumba, and he really did look as if he might try to turn the Congo into a first world nation. And the American CIA and the Belgian authorities, and possibly Britain's MI6, although the detail is contested, worked together to have him assassinated and installed the dictator Mobutu, who remained there until 1997, so about 37 years. And again, he murdered, he tortured, he assassinated political opponents, and it's estimated that he stole about $4 billion of the Congo's money and put it in his own personal bank accounts. So if we look at the present day, Uganda and Rwanda are now considered to be the power center for America in Central Africa. Now, some people will remember that in the 1990s, there was a great deal of coverage in the mainstream press about what was labeled the Rwandan Genocide, which was presented as one group of people in Africa slaughtering another group of people in Africa. Now, in fact, the situation was very complex, and there was brutal slaughter on a huge scale in both directions. But what is never mentioned is that actually the Americans were supporting one group of people over there and the French were supporting a different group of people over there. And it was sort of like a proxy war where America and France were vying for control. So France had control, and eventually now the US is dominant in that region. But the brutality is still going on, although there's no discussion of it in the mainstream press. So child trafficking and sexual slavery are commonplace, and American and British weapons exports to the region are at record levels. And after I'd sort of prepared this presentation, I came across a little bit of information more recently about events in Mali, where the government was overthrown in 2020 by military officers from the Malian military, and they were, of course, trained by the US government. So yet another coup. So these things are going on all the time. Mostly they're not discussed by the press, but every once in a while, events there do sort of filter out into the press. So that's the sort of military side of things, and the support for dictators and the overthrowing of governments that the Americans and the British and the French don't really like. But there's also the economic side of things. So we've talked in the past about how the International Monetary Fund, which is usually called the IMF, imposes economic policies on countries that borrow money from the IMF, which are called shock therapy. So this is austerity, where governments spend a lot less money. It's privatization, where, let's say, the water system or the healthcare system is handed over to private hands, and it's deregulation. So big companies from overseas can go and exploit the country. And a study by the IMF itself showed that these policies had been applied in 34 African countries, and they've been a complete failure in 31 of those countries. And so the other three, there were specific reasons why they had managed to survive despite implementing these terrible economic policies. So if we look at an example like Nigeria, if we go back to the 1970s, Nigeria was labeled a middle income country. So that means at the time, there were some African countries that were actually more advanced than South Korea and Taiwan, which are now among the wealthiest countries in the world. Well, the IMF became involved in Nigeria, implemented these terrible policies, and now Nigeria is a low-income country with approximately 70% of the population in poverty. Another example would be Zambia, which in the 1970s was one of Africa's richest nations, but it was dependent on copper exports, and the price of copper exports plummeted. And at the same time, again, older viewers will remember, there was what were called the oil price shocks. So in the 1970s, the price of oil went from approximately $1 a barrel to $12 a barrel. That's a massive increase in price in the space of just a few years. So poor countries trying to import oil just couldn't afford to do it. So Zambia went to the IMF to borrow money, applied these conditions, and now Zambia has widespread poverty. And this happened over and over again. So there's a more recent book written by someone who lives in Africa called Patrick Bond. And he's written a book called Looting Africa, which sort of brings the things that Walter Rodney was talking about up to date, and gives lots of detail about how advanced nations exploit or in Patrick's words, loot Africa. So we end up with this massive transfer of wealth of hundreds of billions of US dollars going from Africa into the pockets of wealthy people in advanced nations every year. And just to round off, it's probably worth mentioning the role of China. So every now and again, you'll see a story in the mainstream press saying, isn't it terrible? China's exploiting Africa. And it's all part of the more general propaganda to portray China as the kind of the bad guys. And there is this sort of unstated assumption that Britain and America and France and so on are the good guys in world affairs. But in fact, every time I've ever researched the role of China in Africa and other poor countries as well, the arrangements they've come up with seem to be much more beneficial to poor countries than the arrangements that Britain and America have come up with. It's much more of a win-win situation. And I think because of this, there is a general sort of trend where African countries are starting to look to China actively. They're starting to look into developing relationships with China, trading relationships, which they believe will be beneficial to help draw them away from the exploitation of America, Britain and European countries. Okay, I think that's probably quite a good place to do a bit of Q&A.
Fabulous, Rod. Thank you so much again. So interesting and so thorough and summarized in such an excellent form. I sort of asked some questions because it's very self-explanatory what you've just told us. So anybody who's watching this can just go through in terms of the linear nature of the effect of the military and then the effect of economics and the way in which three countries which you identified specifically in terms of being the UK, America and France, and how they've effectively spent just centuries looting it and then creating a culture and an economic and jurisprudence base within those countries that still manages to suit their interests, all corporate interests. And I've come up with just a couple of questions just to discuss. I mean, the first question is effectively about the way in which these countries are now overseen. Because you can make that transition historically, can't you? You can look back on history and you can judge it, and then you can be told, well, you can't really judge those times because it was different values, different morality, different social political experiences. And okay, you can say fair enough. So that way, what you then have to come back with is and say, well, okay, that was then, this is now. And then possibly people can say, look at the situation now. It's so much better. Humans have evolved. Human interactions in terms of power have changed dramatically. But what you're effectively saying is we can't even say that. It's changed form, but the outcome is still very dependent upon those old types of behavior, that manipulation, that control. So my question really is what type of ideology is required to see humans in Africa as so expendable?
Oh wow, what a great philosophical question. So I think it's really interesting, and in fact, this ties in really nicely with the media presentation of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment relative to the media presentation of what Britain and America did in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and ultimately Yemen. And they make a huge deal about people fleeing the war in Ukraine, as absolutely they should. It's a really, really important issue. But they never mention the problems caused by the British and the Americans in those other wars and so on. And so I think I wanted to sort of tie in with how you began that question, where you were saying about how things were so different. It was a different time, hundreds of years ago, people had a different mindset. I'm not so sure that's entirely true. I think this is one of these myths that if you look at issues, let's say like slavery, was a handful of people, very wealthy, very powerful, who owned lots of slaves. And the same was true in Britain and America. But lots of people were against slavery. The slaves themselves, I'm sure, were very much against slavery. And slavery ended because pressure was put upon the slave owners and the government by those who didn't buy into slavery. And so you can see that actually, even then, it wasn't just the world was a different place. It was just that elites then, the same as today, believe that the law doesn't apply to them. They can just make up whatever they want to do, that human rights doesn't apply. They can own people as property. They can exploit people, and they can get away with it. Whereas ordinary people, I think, have always felt there's a bit of a problem with the way the rich and the powerful have operated, because you have to remember that back in the sort of colonial era, many people in a country like Britain were incredibly poor, and they themselves were at the same time being exploited by the rich and the powerful and the landowners and so on. So I think it's a bit of a myth that things have really changed. I think actually what I see when I look back through history is the same patterns repeating themselves, that we have a mindset where the vast majority of people probably wouldn't take too much convincing that people in other countries, whatever their skin color, are not our enemy and cannot be exploited and are human beings just like we are. But the people at the top really couldn't care less about human life, couldn't care less about human rights, and they use a very sophisticated propaganda system to get the mass of the population to tolerate what they do. But I think we've talked about this before, that the systems that we have in place do encourage the most sociopathic people to rise to the top, and they really don't care about other people. And if we ever want to change that, obviously we have to look at so many aspects of our societies and why it is that we have all these systems that do reinforce what goes on.
Definitely, and I think what I'm also trying to say, though, is that the profit incentive, the balance sheet priority of corporations, when they go into, and you talk about, the shock therapy, the austerity, the privatization, the evidence that suggests it's been a massive failure. And yet, if you go into the whole essence again of child slavery, child trafficking, the exploitation within these countries, it still requires, whether we concern ourselves here with sociopathy and psychopathy is another issue, but it still requires those people to plunder from these nations for these valuable metals that you discussed, that we use in terms of science, in terms of telecommunications, etc. But it still requires these people to perceive the indigenous populations of all these different countries in Africa, for example, as being inferior. So it's still borrowing from the eugenics, it's still borrowing from the white supremacists of the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. Instead of being able to, I mean, you were guessing that they're educated people, that they've got degrees, and even if they've done business, they would have ethics classes, but they still almost are just a mirror image of the human perspectives that existed centuries, certainly decades, but centuries ago. So I think really it's about this very dominant ideology that seems to have encapsulated them. They're as much trapped by that ideology and those perceptions as the people who are victims of their policies.
Yeah, so you might be right. So there was a word used in there at one point in terms of racism and so on, about thinking of other races as inferior, and there may be some of that, but I think there's a kind of more general thing which is not about racism, in that if the way inequality is going in Britain and America, it won't be that long before inequality is so great that there's a huge mass of people in Britain and America and other advanced nations being exploited in similar ways. And I think it's really about lack of empathy for other human beings more generally, and that other people more generally can be considered as either inferior or irrelevant or unworthy, and so and can be exploited. I think it would be very interesting to chat to executives in these companies in the most exploitative countries, whether it's the mining industries or the weapons industries and so on. And you start to realize that I think they really just do not care about human life at all, as far as they're concerned. I've seen other people who write about this. So Noam Chomsky and various others have said, as far as these elites are concerned, the rest of humanity are no different from cockroaches. If they tread on us and we die and we get exploited and we get ill and so on, they really don't care. They have no empathy.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, we appreciate it. It's a really detailed and in-depth analysis required. Psychology certainly needs to play a dominant part in that. The other thing I picked up on was thinking about it as well, was the number of African dictators and probably the CEOs of these corporations that have probably been to similar or the same fee-paying schools and universities, both in the UK and the US. The Ivy League, obviously, in the US, and Oxbridge and Russell Group universities in the UK. And they're effectively the same people, aren't they, with different color skins in different parts of the world.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And in fact, this is something that I've never really written about, but I have researched it a bit, which is the scale of the operations involving bringing potential future leaders from other countries over to Britain and America and other advanced nations, essentially to indoctrinate them into our way of thinking. We give them scholarships and we say, hey, you're going to be a great leader, you deserve the best education, sort of thing. But actually it's a complex form of propaganda which gets them to buy into Western dominated economic systems and to buy into the kind of Western imperialism, and to structure their economies in a way that will allow global organizations and companies to extract wealth, and to think that that's a reasonable way to do things. And it kind of separates those leaders. I think it's a deliberate intention to separate those leaders from the mass of their population, and to see them more as kind of integrated with us, if you like, sort of advanced nations, and to have a lesser relationship with their populations. And it's all part of a deliberate set of strategies to allow us to continue structuring the world's economy in a way that works for us.
Yes, and if you can find those leaders who also share the perspective that the rest of humanity are cockroaches, then all you're doing then is feeding their materialistic desires. So giving them grandiose places to live and giving them, staff and multiple cars and land. Once you found that person, and if they've been through the Western education system, it's much easier to identify them. Then you just, like you say, you just pluck them and put them in the positions that you want them to be, and keep telling them to be a good boy or girl, but mostly boys, and the riches will keep coming.
Absolutely. And in fact, John Pilger wrote about this, particularly in relation to, he wrote a book some years ago called The New Rulers of the World, where the first chapter was all about Indonesia and so on, but it was looking at how finance ministers of so many countries had been educated in one or two universities in America or in Britain and so on, and that it's much more prevalent than people realize. Yes,
absolutely. Just finishing off, as I say, yet again, absolutely fascinating. There's this. You finished off with this positive vibe that China's interactions with African nations and African states suggests that the African population, generically per se, is a much more positive one. So I guess that we can only hope that if Africa and China come together and gradually push the West away, that the Chinese strategy isn't a cynical one, and it is an absolutely an authentic one.
Yes, it's very difficult to kind of mind read what leaders in other countries are thinking. And obviously, we don't live in those countries. We don't speak their language. We don't read their newspapers on a daily basis. So we can only ever get a very kind of distant second-hand or third-hand feeling for what's going on. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes you can kind of look at facts on the ground. And I think the way China has been constructing what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massive network of roads and railway systems, but it's also going to incorporate shipping lanes to Africa and various other countries and so on, makes me quite optimistic for the future. And I think it's very interesting. For some reason, whenever I kind of think about China's relationship with the rest of the world, I'm often reminded of Henry Ford and the production of the Model T Ford, where the story goes that he realized he had to pay his workers enough that they could in the future become customers to buy his cars, and that the modern version of capitalism, which is really about exploiting the workforce and the suppliers and the employees wherever possible, doesn't really fit in with that model. And so to me, the kind of exploitative model is the American or now British model, whereas the Chinese version is much closer to Henry Ford's idea that actually it's a win-win if every country in the world becomes a first world nation. And so I am cautiously optimistic that that is the way things are, we're heading at the moment. There's a lot that can go wrong, and it only takes one change of leadership for things to change, and that can all be reversed. But fingers crossed. Let's see what develops.
I'm more cynical than you, Rod. I have to admit. I have to lay that out there. Many critiques of capitalism suggest that the West is in a position of wealth because most of the rest of the planet is in a position of being heavily exploited and in much worse poverty. The idea that we can all become first level nations without that exploitation means that we have to replace capitalism entirely, because capitalism only exists because a small group of people suck up from below. If you take away all those people being sucked up, so to speak, you no longer have capitalism. So it does require a very, very radical economic revolution in order for that to be real. And also it has to be remembered as well that the Swedish model with Volvo was very much having a small group of workers who created the Volvos, and they were all given the newest edition Volvo as part of that process. It wasn't about the Henry Ford model of them being able to afford to buy one from Henry Ford. It was they were given it as part of the process of the production and manufacture. I prefer that. If we, forget the fact it's a car and the way it's affecting the planet, I prefer that model so much more than Henry Ford's let's just raise their wages a little bit to make them good customers.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of that Swedish model. I must research that in more detail someday. But I should point out to anybody who's watching that I am the worst predictor of the future there's ever been. I've got so much wrong, and I just find I can never understand. Yeah, I can't understand why humans behave as they do, but we'll wait and see.
We'll wait and see. Fantastic, Rod. Thank you so much, and see you next week.
Yeah, all the best. I'll see you again soon.